Hi, SAS listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah, and I'm your host, Dave Markel. This is episode 160, and it's not just important, it's necessary. What you're about to hear is a replay of a conversation from the Jan Broberg Show, one that I was honored to be a part of alongside Beth Magnetic from the Mormon True Crime Podcast. And we recenter this conversation today because it speaks directly to the most critical problem we face as a society, the dangerous way power protects predators. This isn't just about one case or one monster or one moment in history. It's about how entire systems, legal, political, religious, and social, have been conditioned to do everything except believe a survivor. And it's why a trafficking operation like Jeffrey Epstein's wasn't a scandal. It was a symptom of exactly what happens when we value access and influence more than human dignity. If you've ever wondered how something that obvious, that public, could survive for over 40 years, then listen closely. Because the answer isn't complicated, it's cultural, and it's still happening. Here's Jan, Beth, and me.
Today, I have on our very exciting podcast, I have Beth Magnetic and Dave Markel, retired detective, trauma-informed expert, and also Dave is the host of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, SAS, and Beth also is a podcaster and has a very good show called Mormon True Crime Stories. Did I do it right? Did I say them
Just
right?
Mormon True Crime. Yep.
Okay. So we're all concerned about something that is going on, all over the news and all over the world. But my biggest concern is, how does the Epstein era last for 40 years? How are there only two criminals or so that have ever been convicted? How does it continue and start and go on and on and on and on for decades? And now we have women grown up who were young, underage, speaking on Capitol Hill. How does it happen, you guys? Why? Why? Tell me why.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I've spent the last year and a half really diving into is when crime it radicalizes politically in one way or another. And I really started to uncover this while digging into Mormon cases, where some of the strangest ones, where we look at Chad and Lori Daybell, if you actually look at it, they were politically radicalizing as well. You start to see this trend start to happen, and I was able to uncover multiple cases where it was people who were very, very politically radicalized. And so, thinking about this and diving into it, I have been thinking about, we always think that about people radicalizing left versus right, and that someone will go all the way to socialism or communism or something like that, or all the way to the right to fascism, to the alt-right, to neo-Nazi territory, that type of thing. But in this case in particular, it's like these people were in secret so involved in an authoritarian hidden version of politically radicalizing, where they had their hands in all sorts of political pies and were able to make all of their crimes disappear. So we know that Jeffrey Epstein, he ended up having everything just swept under the rug after he was exposed in Florida.
Mhm.
But because there are so many politicians that are so easy to buy in our government, there was nobody that was going to actually stop him. And so his victims, we have decades of his victims being victimized by the most powerful people in the world. And the fact that we will call out political radicals if they are poor. Meanwhile, we don't call out any type of radicalized behavior if somebody's wealthy. Then we just call it like white collar crime. I don't know. I just think that's a really interesting thing that's been on my mind as I've thought about this in particular.
Yeah, because if you go back this many years, 40 years really, think of all of the different people that have come and gone in the political machinery and power. So, Dave, I know you said, I don't know, I just get, there's no one answer, but something has to have stuck out to you.
In terms of how this has gone on for so long, to your question, and why hasn't something intervened? Beth, you're right. A lot of it has to do with this power structure and the radicalization, but a lot of it, I think, has to do with the manipulation that goes on within the perpetrator mindset. And Jen, you're super familiar with what I'm talking about here, that manipulation and grooming. But Epstein was an expert, a professional at grooming and manipulation, and also at contriving situations that he knew how to pull in other people into his schematic of trafficking and abuse by enticing others to participate also. And I'm not going to get into the moral issues of what causes someone to go after children. There's so much there. But once he was successful with that, as we all know, he was very good at blackmail. And so keeping it going and keeping the whole machinery under wraps the way he did had a lot to do with being able to hold circumstances and participation by others as his leverage to keep it quiet. I think a lot of people knew what was going on, but nobody wanted to make accusations or bring stuff up to light because of that whole thing with even non Epstein rape and sex assault issues with the general public who may see something happening, but they're afraid to say anything because what if I'm wrong? And so I think, a ton of different layers going on with how people are able to keep this under wraps and keep it perpetuating and continuing over and over again for so long.
Yeah, it seems so outrageous. And yet, here we are talking about it now, and still not nearly enough outrage for all of the victims, for all of the buyers. I mean, the fact that he's in prison and that she, who I'm sure was one of his victims in the beginning, but then sidekick, I could be totally wrong, maybe, but to me, she took her own evil turn. And I think now being put into a minimal security prison for her testimony, for her words, why would you be asking her? Why would anybody trust anything that she has to say? Why are we talking to her? She's as much of a perpetrator almost as he is. So I just have a hard time understanding why we're still not screaming from the rooftops, I guess. I guess we are sort of the news, it's in the news. How can we hide it? How come it's okay that we don't have to have transparency?
One of the things that I've been thinking about just I think it was just last week maybe that Donald Trump said something about how he doesn't think that people will understand what it was like in Florida in the 90s. And that context of this was something that was just accepted and, justified, and I'm famous, I'm wealthy, I'm successful, I've earned this is kind of the attitude. I also think of Harvey Weinstein and the parallels between Harvey Weinstein and this whole like, I don't know, couch audition type attitude where they're like, "Oh, I'm doing her a favor. She's just gonna do a little something for me, and then I'll do her a favor." And so, I think that it's one of these things where they justified it like this was the cost of fame, this was the cost of success, this was the cost of getting everything that they wanted. And I think they justify it because it's the way that it always was as far as they were concerned. It was just streamlined and it was brought to them by somebody, who made a business out of this, as opposed to just being, like, the way it was. And we know that President Trump also said in one of his hearings, he was asked about his grab him by the "you know what" comment, right? So he was asked about that and how he said, "You don't even have to ask." And he had said in this hearing that, well, yeah, no, that it is the way it was. You didn't have to ask. If you were famous and successful and wealthy, at this point in time, you didn't have to ask. And so I feel like they got away with it because as society, we were at this place where, well, if girls want to be successful, if girls want to be famous, if girls want X, Y, and Z, this is the price. And it was a way for us to be able to look down on women and their success and say that they didn't earn it. They slept their way to the top.
Yeah. And that Harvey Weinstein, that feels like very, reminiscent of what I would have heard from people, years ago, before I was podcasting and before I was publicly really telling my own story, and I would kind of sit back and think to myself, well, don't they know that there's all this pressure? There's this very weird dynamic between somebody in power, somebody in leadership, whether it's in an organized religion kind of way, or it's in a school system, or it's in your business, or you're an actress, whatever. And I would just think, but don't people know that young girls aren't capable of even knowing what they want, or they're not even capable of that. The brainwashing is just really interesting. I mean, there were a number of women that went up to Capitol Hill and talked about it, but I'm like, where's the thousand? I wanted, 1,000 women to come forward. But still, I think people are scared. So it plays into exactly what you're saying. I see Dave shaking his head.
Fear is a huge player in every coming forth. I mean, if someone comes out and says Epstein did this to me, or Weinstein did this to me, or Bill Cosby did this to me, or Michael Jackson did this to me, the very first thing the general public says is you're just after money. You're
Yeah.
just after fame. You're looking for your 15 minutes of camera time. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that when you're a victim trying to move to survivorship, you're trying to heal, you're trying to make sense of all of this, your mental capacity to even talk about what happened is diminished by the trauma itself. And I think there's a huge gap between what it is that you and I and Beth are talking about here on this show and what listeners are expecting to hear, and that which is understood by most lay people, which is they don't understand the neuroscience of trauma. They don't understand how the fear cascade works and what those lasting impacts are. So, if they had, for instance, told someone shortly after they were raped or sexually assaulted, and that response that they got from whoever they told was negative even a little bit, they're not going to continue with that momentum of telling their story. And in fact, their healing process is going to be stifled to a large extent. When you talk about how this could keep going on and on and on, there are victims who won't ever tell their story, who won't ever come forward, maybe until they're on their deathbed, maybe till 50 years later when they think, I've got to get this off my chest. And they're in their 70s, 80s, or 90s and haven't dealt with it and now are ready to because they realize that they're in their sunset years and, oh, well, it's not going to harm me any more than it already has. And I need to get this off my chest. And then again, the response from the layperson isn't understanding and empathy and knowledge of how trauma impacts the brain, but rather if this really happened, you would have told somebody earlier on. You wouldn't have held this back for 50 years. Why are you bringing it out now? And so there's blame, there's ridicule, there's disbelief. And those are the three things that most likely re traumatize someone. So, why would somebody re traumatize themselves when they see other people being re traumatized and diminished and ridiculed every day in the news? You talk about those women who went to DC and talked about what Epstein did. How much of that impact lasted? Where is it now? What does the general public think about those women now?
What? It's not even a month later.
And it's forgotten, and it's
But
the
I
impact is almost gone. There's a few of us talking about it, but the people who are talking about it are those of us who understand trauma and fear and impact of rape and sex assault.
Jan, I was just gonna say, as Dave was talking, I was just thinking about you with your story, where you had some crazy stuff happen, and B. Berchtold did not have the influence that somebody like Jeffrey Epstein did, and yet your community took his side over you. And so we think about this like on this global scale where we have like Prince Andrew, who has some of the greatest authority and credibility on the entire planet. And so I think of Virginia Giuffre coming out and saying that he did this to me and this horrible thing happened to me. If it took years and years and years for anybody to take her seriously, and it took years and years for anybody to take you seriously, it's almost a wonder that we've even gotten here.
Right.
And it is a wonder. But when you analyze what trauma does to the brain and understand the neuroscience of it, you have to go back to the very core function and purpose of the brain. The number one task of the brain is to keep you alive. And part of keeping you alive is keeping you from harm. And so those two kind of go hand in hand. Your brain is basically doing all it can to keep us from harm and keep us alive. Keeping us from harm has to do with not facing the reality of trauma because when we do, it hurts. It puts us at risk. It makes us vulnerable. It makes us fearful. It makes us shake and tremble and all of the issues that come up with the fear cascade, that all that is triggered or activated in the hormonal system of our brains and our glands that release all those chemicals and electrical impulses and vibrations. That just takes over the body, and the first thing your body wants to do is shut down from all of that. The same goes for the general public. Maybe people who've never been raped or sexually assaulted, they start talking or hearing people talk about rape, and the first thing they wanna do is, "I don't wanna listen to that. I don't wanna hear that. I don't wanna have anything to do with that." That's why, Jen, your show's doing fantastic, but my show just kind of plateaued. There are a certain amount of people who just want to hear more and more and more about these issues because either they were sexually assaulted or raped or because they're trying to learn more about what they can do to help. But that's the minority of the general population. Most people, in order to protect themselves and their psyche, don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it. How long's that been going on? Well, let's evaluate that. That's been going on since the beginning of humanity. How long's that been? Millennia. How long is it going to take to change that? Probably millennia. But
Yeah.
we have to start somewhere, right? And
Yeah.
that's what I see happening is that the public is finally, within the last 10 years, starting to acknowledge that rape and sexual assault is a prevalent issue in our society. And yes, recognizing that the power and control is those with money and position. You're right, Beth, 100%. But how are we going to conquer that? By doing what we're doing right now. And that's talking about it. That's why I say on my show, we have to normalize the conversation. In order to normalize the conversation with everybody, we have to keep talking about it over and over and over again to the point where people become accustomed to the fact that, yes, those of us who've been raped or sexually assaulted or who investigate or try and prosecute these crimes are going to be so talkative about it, so used to talking about it, and so widespread in our message that eventually the general public is going to join that and want to know more and start talking about it themselves and get past that fear and and resolve to not even face it. That's
Yeah.
the point we have to get to, and that's gonna take decades or centuries.
And it's interesting in an interview that Mariska Hargitay did on her 60th birthday, and it was in People magazine. And she said, if people could talk about sexual assault like they talk about cancer, we could probably find a cure if we talked about it enough. We could, and she said, it's not because we want to normalize it or make it like people, are insensitive. We want the opposite to happen. We want to find ways and reasons to bring this forward so that we can find a cure, so to
And
speak.
it's so much more prevalent than cancer.
Yeah.
But we're not going to talk about that. A few months ago, I had a brain scan done at Amen Clinics where they look at your brain and they can see how the blood flow and the energy and electricity fire in your brain and these types of things. And one of the things that they saw on my brain scan was they said we can see the PTSD in your brain. We can see the actual places that PTSD has caused permanent damage to your brain that we're going to work on things to help address it, but they can actually tell. that there's a lot less activity in certain parts of my brain and too much activity in other parts of my brain. And so I think one of the other things is that when you have severely traumatized people, we do not always express or interact with the world in healthy ways. And
Yeah.
so then we are written off as crazy people. We're written off as histrionic or borderline personality or, lots of different things where people are not going to believe us because they think that we're insane, and our nervous systems are going to respond, and we're going to, have twitching or some type of thing that makes it look like we're having some sort of neurological issue because we are. And it's not because of something that we chose or something that we did or something that we profoundly like just woke up and decided to be one day, but our brains actually have visible trauma and damage from these horrible things that happen to us.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Right.
then we're not taken seriously because of it.
And that's the neuroscience of trauma that I'm talking about. When
Mhm.
when when people start recognizing that trauma has a permanent impact on our brains and therefore the way we think and therefore the way we act, then yes, we will start normalizing. And again, like you said, Jen, we don't want to normalize it in the sense that we're trying to numb people to the
Right.
reality of it. We're trying to normalize it to where people aren't afraid to talk about it anymore. We want to make that conversation something that is as common as, say, cancer. But you're right, Beth. There's a whole lot more prevalence with rape and sex assault than there is cancer, but yet we're able to talk about cancer. Why? Well, because we know that's inevitable. Just like we can talk about death, because death is inevitable. Our psyches, our human makeup has made that realization again since the beginning of time. But rape and sex assault isn't inevitable. It's not something that we all walk around expecting to happen to us one of these days, like death, because we all know we're going to die. We all know we have the possibility of contracting cancer, but the idea that we would be raped or sexually assaulted to someone who's never been raped or sexually assaulted is that'll never happen to me. And besides, I don't want to talk about it.
And I think also, if it hasn't happened to you yet, you need, like Dave, what you were talking about, how our brains need to protect us. Our brains need us to stay safe. Our brains need us to stay alive. So my brain is going to convince me that this threat isn't going to happen to me. And the people that it has happened to, it's because they chose something, because they did something, because of something that I'm smarter than them. And I'll never end up in that scenario where
Right.
it will happen.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
That's what they think.
That's what they
So
think.
that is so what
Uh-huh.
they think. And what's interesting about that is that I just remember when I first started to just tell people my story, long before there were documentaries, a 9-part series, long before there were books, anything. And I would tell people, and then I just look at them and just check them out. Do they believe me? Do they believe me? And the first time that somebody, and she was a hairdresser, and it was one of the first times that I lived in Los Angeles. So my little son was only like 4. Somehow we got talking about our lives, or I don't remember how it came up, but I ended up basically telling her my story, hairdresser, therapist, they're very similar. And I just remember she stopped and she put her things down and she looked at me and she said, "That really happened to you." It wasn't a question, but it was like a declaration. Like she knew I was telling the truth. And she was like, "Oh my gosh, we have to tell that story." And I was like, "What?" She goes, "My husband, he works for one of the biggest agencies in the world." And I think at the time it was William Morris before they joined forces, and it became WMA. But she said, "He could find somebody to tell that story. I mean, he's an agent. That's what he does." And then, I don't know, she got some information from me. I mean, I had nothing. I didn't have a book. I didn't have anything. Just, thanks for doing my hair. It looks good. And off I go. And then, like a month later, when I went back, or she had called me, "Come back, I wanna talk to you some more," and she said, "Can we go to dinner with my husband?" I said, "Sure," and so, packed up my little Austin, and we went to dinner in LA somewhere, a nice restaurant, he paid for it. I was broke, as I've been my whole life, which I think has something to do with my trauma. Anyway, long story short, as he's talking to me, he's like, "I just really wanna be able to help you, but so far, everybody that I've talked to, says that they don't wanna hear any stories about child abuse." And I was like, well well, then how are we gonna, and I didn't know what to say at the time, I wasn't exactly who I am today. who doesn't shut up about it. But I was like, "Well, how are we gonna make it better if we don't talk about it?" And I just remember he's like, "I'm gonna try again. I'm gonna try again." And 3 months later, basically came back to me and he goes, "I called every person I know that makes movies. I called important actors. I called on different agents and different writers." And he goes, I can't find anybody that'll listen. They say they're so sorry and they wish you the best of luck in telling your story and getting the message out there, but nobody wants to hear those stories. They just won't do it." And I thought, "Wow, that's so disappointing. I didn't know that was, like, something so taboo because I felt like I could talk about it to my parents, even though I didn't tell them the gory details. I didn't wanna talk about that, but they didn't, force me to. They were just like, "We're here when you need us," you know? I really didn't know. And now in these, like you said, Dave, the last 10 years, or maybe it was you that said in the last 10 years, that people are starting to talk about their stories. And I'm like, wow, when I came out with that book in 2003, the year Elizabeth Smart was found, that was my genesis. That was my moment for going, I have a story to tell. I wanna tell it because people were interviewing about her and to people on the street and, "Oh, what was wrong with that girl? Why didn't she run in the street and start screaming?" And I was so shocked. And I was like, "I know why she didn't run in the street and start screaming. She was brainwashed, and I know why, I know how it happens." And so it was that moment that I wrote to Oprah, and I never got on her show because her show was over by the next year, but her producers also said, "You should keep telling this story. It's gonna become a thing where people are talking about these stories. You should keep talking about it." Even though we don't have a slot for you to come on the Oprah Winfrey Show. And it emboldened me. Whereas before I felt so shut down. And by this time, my son was not that old. I mean, he was born in '89. So he was, what is that, like 16 ish. But I remember that, in 2003, where I was like, wow, I need to tell my story. I'm going to keep telling my story. And I've noticed also so many more people have been talking about it. However, when it comes to the rich and famous, whether you're a famous politician, they still have the power to not release the files, to shut things down, to not be transparent. And I'm like, we need to demand that the survivors are heard, that we hear them, not just for that one moment, which was an amazing moment on Capitol Hill when they all were there speaking, but how would the public at large, anybody listening to any of our podcasts, and to this one in particular at this time, how would we tell somebody to make room to support and believe survivors, especially when they were traumatized as young people, whether they were boys or girls? There's something so significant that happens to our brains. And Dave, you said this to me just recently when we were chatting at breakfast, I think. You said what people don't understand. People go, "Well, everybody has trauma. Everybody has trauma." Yes, that's true, but not this kind of trauma. And Dave, you said it really plain. This is different. How do we tell and see the difference and then support the telling of it?
Jen, that's the $68,000 question. And that's what we're here talking about. How do you do that? Well, if we knew how, if there was something different that we could do than what we have been doing for the past 10 years, we would not be sitting here talking like we are right now. We wouldn't be asking that question. There's just that wall that I keep referring to in terms of the fact that the human psyche doesn't want to hear this. Most people don't want to talk about it. There are very few of us, the three of us, and yes, there's thousands more, but the thousands that get this are usually survivors
Yeah.
themselves or well-educated psychologists, researchers, and research psychologists and psychiatrists that understand the human psyche and what it means to be raped and sexually assaulted. But it's different than anything else. It's different than, like I said before, we all understand that death, as horrible as it is inevitable. We're all going to face it, and we know how to handle it to some degree when it happens to people that we love. We lose our grandma or our parents, or as a parent, we lose a child. It's hard to cope, but we all understand that everyone dies. We don't all understand that the possibility of being raped or sexually assaulted is very real, very prevalent, and happens day in, day out, mostly from people who we trust and who say they love us or have some sort of care or concern over us. Those are the perpetrators. I think it's a lot higher than the published 75 to 80% being somebody that we know. I think it's closer to probably 90% or even higher that perpetrators are known to the victims and survivors. And that's another huge part of this. The secrecy issue, the not wanting to talk about it. Victims and survivors are being shamed every day into keeping their mouths shut so they don't ruin family relationships or ruin people's careers, and all of that plays a part. That's why I said this whole issue is so multifaceted, multi-layered. The dynamics of keeping it quiet are vast and huge.
I wasn't raped until I was 35. And so I feel like I have a more unique experience of being able to have lived my life thinking I understood and then finally understanding. And one of the things was that, like, before it happened to me, I was in this position where I felt like, oh, that's rough. That's sad. I feel bad for you. And that's awful. It shouldn't have happened to anybody. But I think I unconsciously judged people that they had done something to bring it onto themselves, even though I might have felt like I didn't think that. I think that unconsciously I believe that. I also felt like it's like, well, it's a bad thing and it happened to you, but it's something that like, okay, somebody like violated your body, move on. And that was very much my experience with it until it happened to me. And then once it happened to me, I felt I had hallucinations, I had psychosis creep in, I had very, very bad mental health problems that started to be born out of this. I developed mast cell activation syndrome where I'm allergic to absolutely everything. My entire body shut down. I've developed autoimmune disease since then. I've had all of these horrific things. I think of there's a scene in Game of Thrones where one of the characters who she has been brutally raped over and over for a very extended period of time, but she's talking to somebody about it later, and she's telling him, "I can feel him right now. Right this very minute, I can feel him doing it over and over and over again. I know you think that I mean this, like, rhetorically. I know that you think that I mean this, like, in some idea. No, I literally can feel him doing it to me again." And until I had experienced that for myself, I thought I had empathy for people on it. I thought I could understand, what they were getting at and why it was traumatizing and that type of thing. But then when I actually lived it and felt what it did to my body and my brain as a grown woman, like I just think of those of you who experienced child sexual assault. How were your brains ever supposed to make any sense of that? I I completely felt like I went crazy trying to process and deal with it. I just wonder how much of the world who hasn't experienced it that they're sitting there thinking that they get it and they don't. They think that this is, just something sad that happened in your life when this is something that threatens your body for years to come after it actually happens and damages your brain, damages your nervous system, your immune system. It destroys you. I think people think they believe us. I don't think that they can fully believe us until they go through it themselves.
It's lifelong. I don't care how much healing you think you've accomplished. There's no such thing as total healing from rape or sexual assault. There's just not. And you hit the nail on the head, Beth. It changes the brain physically, but it also changes the brain cognitively. Those neural paths and the capability of thinking your way past it can't occur. It doesn't happen. And again, that's another thing that makes this so different than any other experience that a human can go through. It's life altering.
Yeah. And I appreciate your bringing that out, Beth, because I think, my show and my, of course, focus is generally on young people and where the brain hasn't fully developed and then the arrested development that follows and the way that that trauma affects the rest of your life, and I just don't think enough people can understand it. that it doesn't even matter that it happened when you were 7 or 12 or 16. At 35, it still affects you for the rest of your life. And there is something different about talking to people who get it. That's why you're both sitting here. Dave gets it. You get it. I get it. It's different when we converse as opposed to how the public sees things and how we are trying to inform the public at large so that these sorts of files that they aren't redacted, that we get to that we believe enough. Dave, you're a retired detective. How many times did somebody come in and report a crime and you immediately said, "But what were you wearing when the robber came in your door and robbed your television?" I mean, never, right? This is the only crime that we don't get to be innocent. It's acted like if we tell, we're the bad guys, you know?
Yeah, we're disrupting the normalcy of everybody's daily lives. Why would you want to bring that up? Why are you making waves? Why are you rocking the boat and trying to make a big deal out of this? We're not trying to make a big deal out of it. We're trying to lessen the prevalence. We're trying to get rid of rape culture. We're trying to get rid of the mentality that says, yeah, this happens, but you just have to, deal with it and move on. It's difficult because not only do perpetrators, this is really controversial and very difficult to talk about, but the whole thing with a perpetrator who's had an accusation made about them will do things that minimize, deny, and blame the issue away from them. That's a defense mechanism of the brain, also. But if you stop and think about what we as victims experience, we experience minimization, denial, and blame. So we minimize what happens to us, or we try to. We oftentimes deny what happens to us, and then we blame, and the blame, unfortunately, usually falls on ourselves. I should have not drank as much as I did. I should have not been at that party. I should not have agreed to go with this person, or I shouldn't have been so flirtatious. It's all these shame acts that we think brought on the rape, which didn't. Those weren't what causes rape. Rapists cause rape, and they look for vulnerabilities in many, many more aspects than what a person's wearing, how much they've had to drink, or where they are. So that's why we see people who you would least think would ever be a victim of rape or sexual assault get raped and sexually assaulted, because it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter where they are, what they wore, or how much they had to drink. What matters is who they're with at any given time. And if it's a perpetrator, somebody with that mentality, the likelihood of being raped is very high. And if they've been raped once, the likelihood of being raped again is even higher.
Yeah.
How do we solve this? How do we get this in hand? How do we resolve much of what we're talking about? We keep doing what the three of us are doing right now and try and get more people to do it also.
Yeah. So when those women did come to Capitol Hill and what they had to say and just witnessing the hugs that they gave each other, I know you're not lying. I know you're telling the truth and I'm here. I get, that kind of community that is built with survivors and many survivors who do want to help. There are many who do. I mean, if you consider there's about 1 billion people on the planet who have suffered sexual assault and abuse as young people, 18 and younger. If you were to do the math of all the different vulnerable communities and around the world, it'd be about 1 billion. There's probably about 1 billion more who have experienced because they figure it's at least a quarter of the entire population of the world. So another billion people who are adults who suffered rape and exploitation in adulthood. And many people really do want to help. I get that every time that I interview somebody. And I think is our first line of defense these public things that are not the backyard. They're not the backyard predators that are everywhere. And they are everywhere and it is happening in everybody's backyard. I can guarantee it. But do we jump on the bandwagon when it is like the most powerful people in the world are trying to make sure that these files of Jeffrey Epstein's are not released because of the list of names that could be on it? because that's what these survivors said. The files would contain flight logs, calendars, ledgers, communications, and potentially names of people connected to Epstein's network. And they are the rich and famous and powerful. There are people on there. They've called on Congress and the DOJ to compel disclosure. Some survivors promised to compile their own lists if official releases remain blocked. Why would they remain blocked? How do we raise our voice, at least here, with something public that people apparently care about because we've had a lot of people say so? How do we do it? I know that we're talking, and that is exactly what needs to continue.
I don't know, I have a slightly cynical response right now. So in the state of Arizona, ever since this year began, the state legislators have worked to systematically strip services from the disabled community. So I have an autistic son who is severely developmentally disabled. And he has had many hours of service that he was able to get. I was able to get paid for some of the hours because there aren't enough caretakers in the state of Arizona to be able to take care of the kids. So they had created a program so that the parents could get paid for the hours that we can't find caregivers for. So since January, the state legislators have worked and they have cut the hours for that for people like my son. My son's losing 60% of those hours. And I have posted over and over and over and over and over and over and over, tagging the Arizona House GOP as well as certain legislators in the House, as well as engaging with them on their X accounts. I've said to them, you're setting this up so that the kids are going to end up being institutionalized and they will be raped. Because if you go into an institutionalized setting and put developmentally disabled children in there, it is 50% of the boys are raped and 80% of the girls are raped that we know of.
That we know of. And that's a real statistic, and we're not making it up.
And these are people who cannot communicate that they're being assaulted. There's no way to be able to prove it most of the time. So I honestly think that that 50 to 80% is not as high as reality would reflect. And so we look at the perpetrator in England. Savile was his last name. Do you guys know who I'm talking about? He was knighted and he had been an actor and on shows and all sorts of things. And he had assaulted hundreds of people who were in institutions and hospitals. Jimmy Savile, thank you so much. So I'm trying to remember if it's Netflix or Disney. There's a documentary on him, and it's horrific. And he died having gotten away with it. And there are tons of videos of him being interviewed on talk shows where he alludes to it out in the open, and no, everybody just laughs it off. And then they were able to go on to prove that I don't know, I want to say 500 is the number that's coming to mind, victims, and nobody did anything. And so at this moment, and he was going into institutions. He was going into places where there were vulnerable children, and he got away with it. If he was doing that, how many other people are doing that? How many other people? So when I was trained, I had to be trained in Title IX, which is laws to protect the disabled population. And that's where they told us about the 50% of boys and 80% of girls who are raped in institutions. But they talked to us about how there are, right here on this call, there are predators. There are people who are here getting trained right now that we know are predators, and so you have to call it out, call everything out. But the people will choose this industry because they want to get away with it, and they will in this
And they
industry.
have access.
Access to people who can never speak up against them.
Yep.
And so as I'm sitting here, I feel like I am screaming into the void about this issue of how we're talking about institutionalizing trans people. We're talking about institutionalizing the mentally ill, the unhoused. We're talking about institutionalizing all of these people, and that becomes access to predators, to people who cannot escape, people who cannot get out of the institution, people who cannot keep themselves safe from the people that will do this. And so it's just so frustrating to me that we're in this state where, yeah, we're talking again about institutionalizing people even though we know the risk, we know what happens to them, and nobody seems to listen.
Yeah, didn't we have a mental health, those institutions that got shut down because of this very thing and many other crimes, physical and punishments and drug, abuses and uses and all the things. And we stopped some of that mental health problem before we even called it mental health. We just put crazy people over there, or, people on the
Yeah,
street that were
right.
muttering or whatever, homeless and unhoused, as you said, and
Hmm.
children and adults in need of mental health care went to places that didn't care for them, and we shut that down. And now we're talking about what? Is it because it's big business? Like our jails and our we got to keep people on drugs, get them out and they won't be able to handle it and they'll come right back to us in jail because we got to keep the money going. Money, money, money. Is that it? Is that where we're at? That's just so depressing and horrible. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so I'm sorry, like I don't have like a great what do we do about it because so far my experience has been I'm screaming into the void about, hey, there's this horrific problem, and then I'm treated like I am a crazy blue-haired radical leftist
Yeah.
who just doesn't want her son to get raped.
Yeah.
It's maddening.
It is maddening. Dave,
Anything better than me?
we got 2 blue hairs over here. Let's get to the middle of the road, Dave. Got any ideas?
Man, I wish I did. I mean, we're kind of gone full circle about what the problem is and how it's perpetuated and asking the question, how do you stop it? Again, I think it goes back to this whole mentality of we don't want to face it because it hurts too much. I don't want to think about it. You talk about institutionalizing the marginalized and those who are most vulnerable and putting them in harm's way on purpose. And then, Beth, you can do all the shouting and letter writing and screaming and podcasting you want. But the people who make that decision are saying, don't tell me that. I don't want to hear it. It hurts too much. But we have to do something to get rid of this vast amount of money that we're spending on the marginalized and those who need it. So, oh well. And the oh well destroys societies.
It sure does.
That's where we're at. We're just shrugging our shoulders saying, oh well. And look at what is happening to this society as a whole.
So it was brought to my attention in an earlier podcast I did that may be coming out after this podcast that we are spending something like 40 billion with a B, $1 billion on the drug fight, with the border and the cartels. And that's what we spend. And we're trying to do this thing. We spend, according to what I was able to find to try to verify this person who told me this, who's is an activist and was institutionalized in prison at 16 until he was 35, had 15 felonies. By the time he was 16, nobody asked him, "What's wrong? What's happening at home?" "Oh, are you being raped by 7 men?" "Oh, that could be a problem." Nobody ever asked. Went to jail, 16 till he was 35. And he said that we only spend about 200 million with an M on protecting children, helping them after not even helping them after being trafficked or after being exploited or after being raped. That's what I scream about is where is the help for after, the aftermath? But just in, finding them and trying to, help them and discover and put people behind bars that are, exploiting and trafficking children. And I'm like, that doesn't even take into account the backyard trafficking of my the latest person that I just talked to trafficked from our own basic backyard. So I know that we're talking about things that we're not going to probably solve in our lifetime, but if I could do something to put us on a trajectory of making a solution, does it start with laws, Dave? Does it start by understanding we live in a rape culture? Does it start by using our voices about what's happened to us, Beth? What would be something that anybody listening could take away? And is it writing to, our representatives and saying, please, can we spend more money on this and less money on that? Is it just who we elect? I don't know. I'm just wondering because I know people don't want to just leave the show going, oh my gosh, it's so discouraging. It's all so
Yeah,
terrible.
right.
Because I'm a hope person. My last person I lit a candle for, it was this. It was my candle of optimism that smells like orange blossoms and sandalwood. And I lit a candle for her for our interview because I am still an optimistic person at my heart, but I am angry and upset that this continues to be the way it is. Just the oh well.
I do think that we have to get different politicians in. I think that there are certain laws that need to be changed with how politicians engage with office because they are going to be passing laws based on who's going to be paying them $1 million bounty, right? And so we need to have laws that make it so that they are not able to have lobbyists in their pockets. And if we can get rid of the lobbyists in their pockets, they might actually start passing laws and making policy and that type of thing that helps actual people instead of giant corporations.
For their constituents.
Yeah, this is one of those cases of they're not helping the people, they're helping, these giant entities who will then pay them a lot of money. If we had laws in place that made it so that they're not able to receive that money and they're not able to receive any money from or buy stocks or anything like that for 5 years after they leave office or whatever, they might actually treat this as like a government for the people by the people. And until we could get money out of politics, I don't know how we get them to care about regular people like us. So, the action step would be how do we put momentum behind campaigns for people who are actually committed to doing what's right by the little guy instead of by these giant corporations? I think that's who we have to get into office and I would say left and right are both just going by whoever pays them the most.
Yeah.
That's the problem. Both sides. I mean, if you're talking left and right or conservative and liberal, whatever you want to label it as, the corruption is across the board. And money talks, unfortunately. And trying to get the big corporations out of the picture is next to impossible, if not impossible, because that is where the money is. How do we solve that? I don't have answers for any of this. I guess, again, goes back to what we were saying before, don't stop trying
Yeah. Don't stop
and
talking.
talking about it and telling the masses as much as we can that this has to change. And the pendulum swings. I mean, yeah, we did get rid of institutions that did lobotomies on people and raped and sexually assaulted the people who were committed to those places. But we're going back to that, as you said, Beth, and until it gets to a horrific level again and the pendulum starts to swing the other way, I think we're in for more of that. It's sad to say, and it's, as you said, it's almost a cynical kind of look at things. But I think we have to get past the cynicism and keep pushing the realities. And that's what we're doing here is talking realities. And
Yeah.
we have to continue talking about the reality of the situation and holding up those who are most vulnerable and supporting them and encouraging them. And I know, Jen, that and you too, Beth, probably have this huge resultant communities of support from your listeners and previous guests. And I know I do that the people who've been guests on my show have reached out to other guests and said, let's do something about this. And Lee Cooper is a perfect example. He's a photographer in Manchester, and he was a guest on my show and started a community of survivors. And Victorious Voices keeps growing because of his initial efforts. And I think that's what we have to do is keep doing what we're doing so that these support groups and these vocalizations keep reverberating to our society
Yeah.
across the
Echoing.
globe.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Around the world. And you also, Dave, on your show, you interviewed Jessica Michaels. She was one of the women who spoke up on Capitol Hill. What did you think of her? Was she easy to believe?
Oh my gosh, because I already understand the dynamics here. Yes, she was an amazing guest and her story is horrific, but the thing that's great about Jess is that she will not stop fighting. And she has joined forces with lots of different organizations. Callisto's another one of those great organizations that are doing phenomenal work in getting the word out about perpetrator mentality and how to draw in people who've been victimized and get them to join together to put an end to those serial perpetrators that are out there. And there's actually great things that are happening because of the three of us and the things that we're trying to do. And we can't stop recognizing that in spite of the fact that we do feel like sometimes throwing up our hands and we do feel like the cynicism is overwhelming at sometimes. But, the good that's going to come out of this in the long run is worth every bit of frustration that we're feeling and motivation that we get out of that frustration to keep talking and keep pushing and keep community building and keep these podcasts on the air and keep encouraging victims and survivors to not only heal but to speak out
Yeah.
and join a community where multiple voices are stronger than just a few or just one.
I think also just you made me think of this, Dave, is Jan, you were just talking about how it's 1 in 4 people who's been assaulted. That means that there's 25% of the world that would resonate with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And it's higher than that when you start to factor in that, like, a mom may not have been assaulted herself, but her child was, and so then she has that connection to the story, or her best friend was, or something like that. I think we have to stop buying into the story that nobody cares about this because a huge, huge portion of us have experienced it firsthand, and there are people who care about us who they're invested in it too. And so we can't let them push this story on us that people don't care, people don't want these stories. As we saw, Jan, the world like wanted your story. They needed your story and they ate up your story.
And
Yeah.
still are.
And yeah, and still are.
And I think that was brutal honesty. To be really fair about telling my story, it was my sisters and my parents and the best friends and the neighbors that literally also contributed in brutal honesty to that original documentary, and much of it that was not even in the documentary. There were, I don't know how many hours that they were able to get from people, but I remember roughly hearing it was 70 to 80 hours of interviews, and it reduced down to 90 minutes. But the parts in there that were so brutally honest that I was so worried about my parents and my family members and some of them being so upset. Like, why would you let them tell that about your dad who was one of the greatest men to ever walk the planet? I'm like, I didn't tell his story, he did. I'm like, he
Mhm.
told it because he wanted to help people, and that brutal honesty is, I believe, why the story resonates, because I know there are parents out there who are in pain over what's happened to their child, that are trying to recognize, "Oh my gosh, why didn't I know about the uncle, the grandpa, the aunt, the grandma?" I mean, I've heard every story, right? The dentist, the school teacher, the person in my church, the pastor, the priest, the person that I went out and served the poor and the needy at Christmas time dinner, and he's actually or she's actually, a predator. There is a huge faction of people who maybe didn't happen directly to them, but who care, and I do believe that if we could somehow, just empower them and let them know that we need their voices. We need their voices to unite with our voices, and in doing so, then we get this bipartisan movement. Who's pushing these files to be released in Congress? We've got Thomas Massey on the right and Ro Khanna on the left, and they are pushing the press conferences. Even Marjorie Taylor Greene said, "Release the files." I was shocked. I about had a heart attack. So these are starting to happen where I feel like people are wanting to know the truth about who's in leadership, who's in these files, who is named. And, I just think it's very telling.
Yeah. What silence and power has been bought by wealthy, wealthy people that is impacting the trajectory of our country and, so many people's lives. I think that it's such an important aspect of this is that people are really waking up over is seeing how much our country is just run by a small group of elite people.
Yeah. And we want to know. We don't want anything withheld. That is important.
Left, right, I don't care.
Right.
They
Exactly.
all they all can go.
They all can go. Yeah, exactly. Because if there's why are they withholding certain things? I mean, it's proof that these documents are worth disclosing. That's proof enough. If you're trying not to have it released, then obviously it should be released. That's obvious to me. I right, Dave? I mean, isn't that just
I
common
totally agree
sense?
with that. Yeah,
Okay.
that makes perfect sense to me.
Okay.
And it's a commonality in all of this is that at first everybody was saying, "Let's release the Epstein files." Even Trump was saying that. That's usury. That's them saying, "Yes, release the Epstein files because that's what'll get me elected." You know? Once they're elected, it's like, "No."
Do not release those files, of course, that is usury. And it's literally manipulating the public, the people, manipulating them by the bait and switch. It's just a constant thing that I'm like, good grief, they said it before the election. Now let's do it.
Welcome to politics.
I think they thought that they were going to be able to just pass off the binders of documents that already existed. I think they didn't anticipate that people actually already knew that all inside and out and would be able to tell that was what they'd already been given.
Yeah. And that there was more that has not been given and that we don't know because they won't release it. I just wish Jessica Michaels and all of the other women who went to Capitol Hill and spoke out and said, because it's scary to speak out against people that are more wealthy, that are elite, that are more publicly connected than you are, because we always have been looked down on. We have always been, well, those girls were trying to get something out of this. They were going to get their fame, they were going to get their modeling job or their dance career or their whatever. And it's all we are left with the fact that it happened to us. And in reality, when you're 13, your brain is not a match for a 40-year-old man. It's just not. And there's no way that you can know what you want or what you think you're going to get out of it. And then you're manipulated and you're bought off and you are brainwashed to believe whatever it is that they keep feeding you. And then afterwards, you're still brainwashed, believing, well, maybe it's not even brainwashed because maybe it's true, but believing that they have power over you to ruin your life, to discredit you because they have more money to market all of their jargon than you do. But I didn't care. At that point in my adult life, I was like, I don't care who believes me or doesn't believe me. I know the truth. I'm going to tell the truth and I'm going to keep saying it until the day I'm dead. I'm going to just tell the truth. And I think it's why a producer from the Oprah Winfrey Show, who was on a different show that I was interviewed on after my story came out from that first documentary, Abducted in Plain Sight. And backstage, she told me, she said, "Do you know how many times people tried to sue Oprah Winfrey?" And I was like, I could imagine a lot of times over, you know, defamation of character and liable and all these things. She goes, "Do you know what Oprah's response was? I guess if it isn't true, then they'll win." Do you know how many times they won? 0. I said, "Well, probably because she had really good attorneys." That's true too. However, she always was like, "We're gonna stand on the side of the truth. And if I believe them, then I'm gonna be pretty sure they're telling the truth because I've been where they are."
Yeah.
I loved that. It gave me so much power. I was like, because he was already threatening. He was threatening all these things. Well, I mean, not at that point. I mean, he was dead by the time I was public with that documentary. But in the beginning, I mean, he did things that people to this day don't know about. Leaving flyers on all the cars at the social services office where my mother worked because she'd gone back to school and become a social worker. And oh, this woman and these salacious, horrible stories about my mom and my dad letting him in so that he had to perform sex acts with both of them until they would, go downstairs and give him access to me. And I'm like, it's all untrue. But guess what? It was all on the side of truth. And I'm still here to tell my tale.
Yeah.
I love that you have told this story because it's one of those stories where, you knew that people were gonna just kinda treat you like, "No, there's no way," because you had said it to so many people and you just wondered, like, "Do they actually believe me or not?" I'm glad that you told it anyway.
Thanks. Me
Me
too.
too.
And I'm very grateful to both of you. Both of you have been on this show, on my show. I've been on yours. And I think that as we embolden our audience of listeners and hopefully that audience grows, people will find their voice. They'll use their voice, and they'll know that in order to interrupt the trauma in your life, it has to be expressed and mitigated. And it's ongoing, like you said, Dave, lifelong. But I am so much farther down the road than I used to be. I don't really get triggered, and I don't know if you guys experience that other than when I see things going into play where I feel like others are being silenced. Then I'm triggered. And I'm triggered in a mama, here comes the bear and the Leo tiger, and my Chinese sign is also a cat. Here it all comes, and you're just gonna hear me roar, then I get triggered. But it's not because I can't tell my story anymore. Every time I've told it, it's helped me survive it better and do better in my own life and my own healing. I want people to know your voice is your most powerful tool. Thank you for sharing yours, Beth, and yours, Dave. Any final closing comments or thoughts?
Well, not only to the three of us as encouragement not to stop, but to every ear that's listening to this, every eye that's watching it, don't stop proclaiming what we need to proclaim. And that is that the prevalence rate is far beyond what most people recognize, and that community support is most desperately needed. Don't stay silent. Keep talking. Let's normalize this conversation to the point where we can talk about it without fear, without repression, and without fear of some sort of retaliation from those who are perpetrating these horrific, horrific crimes.
I don't think I could say anything to add to that. It's great.
You're an amazing person, Beth. And I
Thanks.
mean that. Sometimes I just think us single moms that are doing the hardest of the hard things, and then we get, you know, cut off from some support that we really desperately need, but we keep going. That to me is just an amazing example of the fortitude that we have and that we are able to do so many hard things, and we have to raise our voices to get things in order, to get what we need back, and hopefully it will happen sooner than later. Wouldn't it be amazing if it even happened in these next 3 years? If that could happen, I would be shocked, first of all, but it would be amazing to see if people can actually see those who said, "We are the people, and I'm the voice, and I'm gonna fight for those people and do the right thing." I would love to see that happen. Dave, I say the same things to you. I think you're an amazing human being. And I know what you suffered through and what you have become in your life. It's just an amazing thing to me. And I was telling Beth earlier about you teaching trauma informed so that all the branches of the military would know how to interview somebody who comes with a problem to them, and so many other organizations. And I wish you were out there doing it every day
Me
in
too.
every police station, in every place in the world, so that we would stop interviewing people as if they are the criminal. You know, it's the only thing. I just want that to be everywhere. What you've been able to bring to the world and bring to so many individuals, you've saved their lives. I know that. And I know telling our stories on our podcast, that's what we're doing too.
Well, and thank you. I'll say this to this audience. Jan's interview is still the number one listened to episode on my podcast. And you're, I think, the second episode, and your numbers are still the highest, and they continue to grow. So thank you for telling your story. Thank you for sticking to your beliefs and your goals of lessening the prevalence rate and doing all we can to help support those who have been victimized and are striving to heal. So thank you.
All right, all you badassery people, let's go. Keep going.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Thank you so much for being here. And we will do this again, I hope. I loved having this conversation with the two of you. It was really, really great for me. So thanks again, and thanks to all of our listeners.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to thank Jan Broberg for allowing me to re-air this episode on this show. It was important for me to get this episode out to as many ears as possible, because this conversation is precisely why this podcast exists, why I show up every week, and why you, as a listener, are not just an observer. You're part of the cultural shift that has to happen. If we don't normalize these conversations in our homes, in our schools, in our churches, in our systems of justice, then we are guaranteeing that what happened with Jeffrey Epstein will happen again. Different city, different name, same dynamic, same damage. So if this episode hit you, don't just move on with your day. Share it. Talk about it. Say the quiet part out loud. Because silence is the greatest enabler of traffickers. And speaking up loudly, relentlessly, and collectively is how we end them. Thank you for listening, and thank you for caring. And most of all, thank you for refusing to look away. It's as important as my other admonition, to start by believing. It's part of helping bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault, and it helps reduce the impact of rape culture and lessen the prevalence rate of those horrific crimes. And it's because we all know someone who's been impacted by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.